The mountains always had a way of silencing the noise of the world. That's exactly what I needed, what we needed. After everything that happened last year, my son, Caleb, had stopped smiling the way he used to. The doctors said a change of scenery would help. So I packed up our old truck, hooked the trailer, and drove until the road turned into dirt and the air smelled like pine and rain. We reached the ridge just before sunset. The trailer sat at the edge of a slope, surrounded by miles of untouched forest. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, just the way I liked it. Out here, it was just us, the mountains, and the slow hum of the wind. For the first time in months, Caleb's eyes lit up when he saw the valley spread out beneath us, golden under the fading sun. Inside the trailer, things were just as I remembered. Creaky floors, the faint scent of pine resin, and a stack of dusty camping magazines from years ago. I lit the small wood stove while Caleb unpacked his favorite blanket and the little model airplane he carried everywhere. The warmth spread quickly, filling the small space with the comforting sound of crackling wood. Dinner was simple: beans, toast, and hot chocolate made from the last tin of powder we had. We sat by the window, watching the light fade behind the ridge. Outside, the forest seemed alive, whispering with the wind, branches swaying like they were talking to each other. Caleb laughed when an owl hooted somewhere deep in the trees. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh in months. When night came, the sky turned clear and sharp. Millions of stars scattered across the dark like glittering shards of glass. We sat outside for a while, wrapped in blankets, watching the constellations. The air was cold and thin, and I could almost feel the mountain breathing, slow, steady, ancient. Caleb asked if Mom could see us from up there. I didn't know what to say. I told him I hoped she could. That maybe, in some way, she was watching the same stars from wherever she was. He nodded, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Later, as he drifted to sleep, I stayed awake by the fire, just listening. The woods had their own rhythm, the rustle of leaves, the distant crack of branches, the low whistle of wind between the trees. It was peaceful, too peaceful. There was something about that silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, I stepped outside to check on the firewood. The air had changed, colder, sharper, carrying a faint metallic scent, the kind that made the back of your neck prickle. The moon had disappeared behind a thick cover of clouds, and the forest that once seemed friendly now looked darker, deeper. I stood there for a moment, listening. No wind, no crickets, not even the sound of the river far below. It was as if the entire world had paused. I shrugged it off, blaming my nerves. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the mountains were playing tricks on me. Still, I threw a few more logs on the fire and went back inside, locking the door behind me. As I crawled into bed beside Caleb, I felt the trailer creak, just once, slow and heavy. Probably the wind, I told myself. But the wind had stopped hours ago. That night, the silence of the forest wrapped around the trailer like a living thing. If I had listened more carefully, I might have noticed it then. The faint crunch of footsteps outside, circling us, just beyond the glow of the firelight. But at that moment, I thought it was just the mountains settling. I was wrong. The sound came just as I was tucking Caleb into bed. 3 slow, heavy knocks against the trailer door. Thud. 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 At first, I thought I imagined it. The wind, maybe, or a branch. But the trailer was solid steel, and that sound had weight to it. It wasn't random. Someone, or something, had knocked. Caleb stirred under his blanket, his eyes half open. "Dad, who's that?" he whispered. I forced a smile. "Probably the wind, buddy. Go back to sleep." But I didn't believe that. The wind wasn't knocking in threes. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and clicked it on. The beam flickered for a second before cutting through the dark. I aimed it toward the window beside the door, expecting maybe a lost hiker or an animal. Nothing, just fog. Thick, white, rolling in fast, too fast. I hadn't seen fog like that in the mountains before, especially not at midnight. The trees outside had disappeared behind it, and the faint glow of our campfire was swallowed completely. I stepped closer to the window, trying to get a better look. Then I froze. There were handprints. Small ones. Pressed against the glass. Not Caleb's. His hands were much smaller. These looked like a child's, but longer, with strange smudges around the fingers as if the skin had left behind a greasy residue. I wiped the glass with my sleeve, heart pounding, and the prints vanished, like they'd never been there. Another knock. Louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. Dad? Caleb sat up now, his blanket clutched tightly. Someone's outside. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt dry. I turned off the flashlight to kill the glare and peered through the tiny crack between the curtain and the wall. There was nothing. Just fog. And then, from the far corner of the trailer, the old radio flickered to life. I hadn't used that thing in years. The power cord wasn't even plugged in. It hissed and crackled, the static twisting into a faint whisper. At first, it sounded like nonsense, a jumble of broken voices. But then, between the static, words began to form. Don't let him. My blood ran cold. The voice was distorted, but there was something horribly familiar about it, something that sounded like her. Like my wife. I shut the radio off and stood there for a long moment, listening. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, the mist curling like fingers against the glass. The entire trailer seemed to groan under the weight of the silence. Then came another sound, softer this time, like footsteps crunching against the gravel. Slow, deliberate, circling the trailer. I moved quietly to the door, careful not to wake Caleb any further. I pressed my ear to the metal. Something brushed against the door from the other side. A scrape. Then a whisper, faint but clear. Please, open the door. It was her voice again. My wife's. The same voice I used to hear when she'd wake me up in the middle of the night just to tell me she couldn't sleep. Calm, familiar, and utterly impossible. My heart twisted. Every instinct screamed to open it, to see her, to believe it. But then I looked back at Caleb. His small form was trembling beneath the blanket. His wide eyes watching me, trusting me. I took a deep breath, stepped back from the door, and whispered, Go away. The whisper on the other side stopped. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps began to move again around the trailer toward the window near Caleb's bed. He screamed. I spun around and saw a shape outside the window, barely visible through the fog. A pale face, pressed against the glass, smiling too wide. I grabbed Caleb and pulled him close, backing away from the window. The figure lingered a moment longer, then melted back into the mist, leaving only the faint outline of its handprint behind. That was the last knock of the night, but not the last time we'd hear that voice. Something had found us in those mountains, and it knew exactly who we were. I didn't sleep at all that night. The sound of that voice, the voice that sounded like my wife, echoed in my head long after the fog had swallowed the world outside. Caleb finally drifted off sometime before dawn, but his sleep was restless, haunted by the same fear that sat heavy in my chest. When the first weak light of morning crept through the curtains, I let out a shaky breath of relief. The fog was gone, the forest visible again, still, calm, almost innocent. It looked like nothing had happened. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that it hadn't. Maybe it was exhaustion, or the altitude, or just grief twisting my senses. But then I saw the footprints. They started near the trailer door and led around. The entire perimeter, deep impressions in the soil, far too large to be Caleb's, and barefoot. The strange thing was their shape, not human, not animal. The toes were long, spread wide like they belonged to something that walked upright but wasn't meant to. I followed the tracks to the tree line, rifle slung over my shoulder. The silence of the woods was unnatural again, heavy and expectant. I stopped when I reached the edge of the clearing. The prints ended there. Just stopped. Like whatever made them had vanished into the air. That's when I heard it. A low growl, deep and trembling, rising from somewhere between the trees. It wasn't close, but it was big. I aimed the rifle into the woods, scanning for movement. Nothing, just shadows. But something was there. I could feel it watching. I went back inside. Caleb was awake, sitting on the bed with his knees drawn up, his face pale. "Dad," he whispered, "Mom was outside last night." I froze. "What did you say?" "I saw her," he said, voice trembling. "She was at the window. She waved at me." My stomach twisted. I knelt in front of him, trying to steady my voice. "That wasn't Mom, okay? Whatever you saw, it wasn't her." He shook his head stubbornly. "It was her. She said she missed me." I didn't know how to respond. The worst part was, some small part of me wanted to believe him. I missed her too, every day. But I'd seen that thing smile, the wrongness of it. That wasn't my wife. That was something pretending to be her. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I kept the rifle close, ears tuned to every sound outside. The woods felt alive, whispering just out of reach. At dusk, the wind picked up again, carrying faint voices between the trees. Not clear words, just fragments, like laughter underwater. By nightfall, the fog returned. Thicker this time. It pressed against the windows like a living thing. The fire flickered low, and every time I looked away, I swore I saw movement, long shadows crawling just beyond the edge of light. Caleb clung to me, shivering. "She's calling again," he whispered. I didn't hear anything at first. But then, soft from outside, came that voice again. "Please, let me in. It's cold." I felt something inside me break. The voice wasn't angry or monstrous. It was gentle. It sounded like her laugh, her warmth, her love. But beneath it, there was something else, a faint distortion, like another voice buried underneath, whispering in sync. I pulled Caleb close. "Don't look at the windows," I told him, then came to scratching. Slow, deliberate, moving along the walls of the trailer. Something was circling us again. The shadows outside shifted, too tall, too thin, their movements jerky and wrong. Caleb started crying, muffled sobs into my shirt. "She wants us to come outside, Dad." "No," I whispered. "She's not your mom." The scratching stopped. Silence. And then, from right outside the window, a shape leaned close, a pale face with hollow eyes and that same stretched smile. Framed by my wife's old jacket, I raised the rifle, finger trembling on the trigger. But before I could fire, the thing turned and vanished into the fog. That night, I finally understood the mountain wasn't empty. Something was in those woods, wearing the dead-like masks, and it had found us. By the time dawn crept over the ridge, I was running on pure instinct, half awake, half mad. The fog had thinned, but the forest still felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the way the trees leaned, as if bending toward the trailer, listening. Caleb hadn't spoken since the night before. He sat on the floor, wrapped in his blanket, staring at the window where we'd last seen her, His small hands gripped the toy airplane so tightly his knuckles turned white. I tried to act calm, to pretend everything was under control. But every time I looked outside, I expected to see that face again. I decided we needed to leave. Whatever was out there, whatever it wanted. We weren't going to wait around to find out. I packed our things in silence while the fire sputtered in the stove. But when I stepped outside, the truck was gone. Not stolen. Gone. The tire tracks ended just a few feet behind the trailer, swallowed by churned-up soil. It was as if the ground had shifted overnight, swallowing the vehicle whole. I stared at the torn earth, my breath clouding in the cold morning air. That's when I noticed it, a faint metallic glint further down the slope. I told Caleb to stay inside and followed the glimmer through the trees. The forest grew denser, the air heavy with the scent of damp soil and something else, burnt metal. When I reached the clearing, I froze. Half buried in the earth was a crash site. Twisted steel, scorched panels, and strange markings etched into the metal. Symbols I didn't recognize. Time had half devoured the wreckage, but whatever it wasn't any kind of plane I'd ever seen. The trees around it were bent outward as if pushed by an explosion long ago, and among the debris were bones, some human, some not. I stumbled back, heart racing. The symbols carved into the metal seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light. And then, faintly, I heard the whisper again, but this time it wasn't coming from behind me. It came from beneath the wreck. Help me. The voice was faint, almost human, desperate. I crouched closer, torn between terror and curiosity. The metallic surface pulsed slightly under my palm, warm, almost alive. Images flashed through my mind, fire, screams, the mountain splitting open, and a figure stepping from the wreck, cloaked in light. That's when I understood. The thing in the woods wasn't evil. It was broken, dying. It had taken the forms of the dead, not to deceive us, but to speak through them. It was using what memories remained, trying to reach out the only way it could. But something else had woken up beneath that crash. Something it was afraid of. The ground trembled. Faint at first, then stronger. I stumbled back as the earth cracked near the wreckage. A sound rose from below, a deep hollow roar that rattled the trees. Caleb screamed from the trailer above. I turned and ran uphill, the forest alive with movement. Shadows rippled between the trunks, not the tall, thin creature from before, but something larger. Something ancient. When I burst through the clearing, Caleb was at the door, crying. Behind him, the trailer's windows were fogging up again from the inside. A shape moved through the mist, its outline unmistakable. It was her again, my wife's face, but softer this time, sad. She reached out a hand and whispered, "Run." The fog exploded outward as the ground split open beneath the trailer. A blinding light poured from the fissure, swallowing everything in its path. I grabbed Caleb and sprinted down the slope. Behind us, the trailer was pulled into the earth with a metallic scream. When the light finally faded, the mountain was silent again. The fog was gone. The wreckage had disappeared, buried once more beneath the soil. We stood there for hours, shaken and speechless, until finally the forest began to sound like itself again, wind, birds, life. I never found the truck. I don't know how we made it back down that mountain. But sometimes, at night, when the house creaks or the wind changes, I hear her voice again, soft, distant, not calling for help this time, just saying goodbye.